In 1994, while patrolling the reserve at night, I came across a trail of missing people. What I discovered next was so terrifying that even years later, I doubt whether I should tell you about it. After returning from Afghanistan in 1989, I was looking for a quiet job away from people. The skills I had learned in intelligence seemed useless to me in civilian life, especially after my wife passed away. She was a biologist, working on some scientific topic here in Siberia. During one of the expeditions to the TAIGA, she and her group encountered something inexplicable. After that, she fell ill with a strange disease. The doctors just threw up their hands. A month later, she was gone. Her son was 8 at the time. Daniel took the loss of his mother hard, withdrew into himself. I knew something had to change. My wife's sister offered to take him to her village, where there was a good school, and the child would be looked after. I myself was floundering. I couldn't find a place. I came to the Central Siberian Reserve in the early 1990s. I worked in a small private security company, and we were involved in a search and rescue operation. A group of tourists had disappeared. Because of my Army experience, I was appointed the head of the search team. That's when I first met Alex Peterson, an old gamekeeper. For 3 days he and I scoured the taiga, found all the missing men scared out of their wits, but alive. There's something about these places that hooks me. Maybe the tranquility of the age-old taiga, maybe the simplicity and clarity of the gamekeeper's work that I saw. Alex Peterson talked a lot about the reserve. In his words, I felt something real, something that was missing in the 90s. A month later, I was already working in the reserve. The cordon on the Stolbovaya River became my home. It was about 60 kilometers to the settlement where my son lived, by river in summer or by winter road in winter. I visited him whenever possible, and gradually our relations began to improve. I still had a night vision device from the Army, a gift from my commander for saving me in one difficult operation in the mountains. It often helped me in night rounds of the territory. The work was not easy, but understandable. I thought I had found my place, a place where I could start my life over again. I did know then that these deep forests held secrets that were best left undisturbed, and that soon I would have to remember everything the war had taught me. The early spring of 1994 was unusually snowy. At night, the temperature dropped to minus 15 degrees Celsius, and during the day, the wet snow fell underfoot, making it difficult to get around the area. During one of these detours, near an old adit in a gap between the hills, I came across the tracks of illegal immigrants. The place was remote. The nearest cordon was more than 40 kilometers away. Here, at the Stolbovaya tributary, in the 30s, they tried to mine gold. Later, the work was abandoned, and only the crumbling entrances to the adits reminded of that era. The first thing that attracted attention was the strange order of the footprints. There were many of them. Obviously, a group of people, but they did not scatter like ordinary tourists or hunters. The tracks followed a clear pattern, patrolling the perimeter. I remembered such patterns well from Afghanistan. Not far from the entrance to the adit, I found abandoned equipment. Simple prospectors' trays were lying around as if they had been abandoned in a hurry. Nearby were parts of some industrial equipment. One piece in particular caught my eye, a massive pulley with strange markings. I'd seen them on drilling rigs. It was about 3 hours before dark. I methodically walked around the territory in a spiral, as I had been taught in reconnaissance. 100 meters from the adit, I found a carefully camouflaged campfire. The snow around it was trampled, but there was almost no ash. But in the crumpled grass, I found a scrap of some statement and a butt of an expensive imported cigarette. When it began to get dark, I settled down on a neighboring hillside. I took out my Army No. 5, the only thing I had taken from the service. Combat himself gave this device after that operation in the gorge. "He saved your life. Let him continue to serve," he said then. At 1 o'clock in the morning, I noticed movement from the riverside. 3 figures were clearly seen through the device. They walked confidently, obviously knowing the terrain. They carried heavy boxes like professionals, easily distributing the weight. One of them was constantly looking back, showing his military training. In the morning, I contacted the director of the reserve by radio. He reported about the violators, expecting the usual instructions for detention. But his reaction surprised me. There was a strange note in his voice when he said that he would send a task force in a couple of days. Usually, such cases required an immediate response. The next night, I watched the edit again. Now there were 5 men. They were unloading something large, like parts of a drilling rig. One had a holster hanging from his belt, poorly covered by his jacket. The other was holding something that looked like an army radio. 2 days later, an unscheduled radio call went out. Nicholas Warren, the director of the reserve, had never before made contact at unscheduled hours. His voice sounded unaccustomedly soft. "Alexei, I've been thinking about your message. You see, these are very difficult times. There are problems with financing in the reserve. Everything is kept on the word of honor. Perhaps we shouldn't be too zealous in patrolling that area." I remained silent, waiting for the rest of the story, and it came. "We're in the middle of a salary review. I think a 50% raise would be fair for such an experienced officer, especially if he understands the specifics of the job." I pretended to hesitate, then slowly replied, "Yes, Nicholas Warren, I understand. Difficult times require flexibility." A distinct sigh of relief sounded through the receiver. In fact, it only confirmed my suspicions. Something much more serious than the usual illegal gold mining was involved. For a week I documented their every move. By day I recorded their tracks and marked their routes on the map. By night I watched them through my NV. They worked on a strict schedule. From 1 to 4 in the morning they brought in equipment, and during the day 2 men with guns patrolled the territory. I needed to find their base. On the night of the full moon, when the snow reflected the moonlight, I followed their tracks along the river. After 5 kilometers, the tracks led to an old hunting camp, only it was no longer a hut. A good warehouse, skillfully disguised as an abandoned hut. 2 new snowmobiles burrin under the shed. And the main thing, a satellite dish cleverly hidden in the crown of an old fir tree. In 1994, such equipment was a rarity, even in cities. Having settled down on the slope of the hillside, I began to observe. Before dawn, a wagon pulled up. A man in camouflage got out of it and looked around. In the pre-dawn twilight, I could hardly believe my eyes. It was the director of the reserve. He opened the door of the warehouse with his own key. In 2 hours, I counted 4 men. They were unloading some containers from the warehouse and loading them onto snowmobiles. They spoke in a muffled voice, but I could make out one phrase clearly. "The new point is ready. The list for next week has been received." When everyone had left, I went down to the warehouse. It's a tough lock. You can't just pick it. But at the window I found a fresh cigarette butt of the same imported brand and a scrap of paper. I unfolded it and got a chill. It was a list, a few names and dates, and at the very end, a fresh entry. Huntsman, Stolbovaya, March 1994. An unsettling premonition kept me on my toes. During 4 years of work in the reserve, I knew every trail, every stream in my neighborhood. It was my territory. And now it was as if she was hiding some terrible secret. Even the animals behaved strangely. They avoided the cleft at the adit, though before there was always life there. In the morning, Michael, an old hunter with whom we often crossed paths on our rounds, radioed in. His son, Andrew, had been missing for 3 days. He'd gone to check the hunting traps near the old adit and hadn't come back. Before he left, he told his father about some strange finds in the area, some iron that didn't look like old mining equipment, said the metal was too new, something unusual. I knew Andrew well. We sat around the campfire more than once, shared stories. He was a strong man, a hereditary hunter, the kind of man who had been walking in the taiga since childhood. They don't just disappear. Last year, he himself led out of the taiga lost tourists, then walked more than 30 kilometers through the driftwood. And the main thing is that he disappeared right there, at that very adit. I started asking about other disappearances. It turned out that several people had disappeared over the last year. 2 hunters, a fisherman from a neighboring village, an old taiga gatherer. All local, all experienced, and all of them disappeared after visiting the area of old mine workings. What was especially disturbing, only those who knew the taiga well disappeared. Casual tourists and mushroom pickers seemed to be of no interest to anyone. The behavior of the locals was also strange. When they talked about disappearances, they averted their eyes and changed the subject. Even the most talkative ones became silent when it came to the adit. It was as if they knew something but were afraid to tell. The old hunter Philip, who always liked to talk about life, turned pale at the mention of the adit and hurried away. His father had once worked there in the old mine workings. That night, I went again to the place where I had seen the gold miners. Now I noticed details I hadn't noticed before. Massive ventilation pipes, skillfully camouflaged with moss and branches. Brand new, with no trace of rust. Fresh scrambles, too smooth to be natural. A wide caterpillar track, obviously from serious machinery, not less than 20 tons in weight. You can't just drag something like that into the taiga. The longer I watched, the more inconsistencies I found. Why are there no traces of gold mining on the approaches to the adit? Where are the rock dumps? Where are the characteristic drainage ditches? Prospectors don't work like this. There was something else here, something much more serious. In the archive of the reserve, I found old plans of adits. The yellowed drawings showed a whole system of underground passages going deep under the hill. But something in these schemes did not fit together. Some tunnels broke off halfway through, others led to dead ends, and on one drawing, dated 1958, there was a note. Object 7, access restricted. In the farthest corner of the archive, in a folder with half-extinct documents, a thin notebook in a calico binding was found. Inside was a list of names. Local residents who worked at the site in the late 50s. Next to each name, notes, positions, security clearance levels. Some of them had strange markings, special control, and on the last page, very familiar names. I recognized the fathers and grandfathers of the very hunters, who now flatly refused to talk about the adit. Gradually, the picture became clearer. It looked like the old Soviet facility was working again, and someone really didn't want anyone to know about it. So much so that people who accidentally discovered it disappeared without a trace. And apparently the locals knew something about it. Something passed down from fathers to children, a secret not to be spoken aloud. I realized there was no more time to think. I had to act. But I had no idea how deep I'd have to dig to get to the truth, and the price I would have to pay for that knowledge. At the end of March, the last of the frost hit. At night, the temperature dropped to minus 25 degrees Celsius, and during the day, the spring sun turned the snow to mush. On one of those days, Voronin got in touch. There was something unnatural in the director's voice as he reported the death of Peter Sullivan, the local mechanic. The talk in the village was that the car had slipped off the jack while being repaired, the usual accidents that happen in garages. But there was something about this story that was bugging me. I had known Peter for years. He serviced the reserve's equipment and helped with snowmobile repairs. Every fall he prepared our machines for winter. He knew them like the back of his hand. In the past, he was an army mechanic who had been through Afghanistan. He worked carefully, always according to the instructions, was attentive to details. The next day I arrived in the village. Peter's garage stood on the outskirts. Old, but good, with good equipment. 2-story with large gates and an annex for storing spare parts. Inside it was always in perfect order. Tools in their places, floors clean, even in winter. Lately he often worked late. The light in the garage windows burned until late at night. Neighbors said he was saving up money to move to the city. No wonder. In '94, many people were leaving the villages. He said something about a better school for his children, about prospects. His eldest son was finishing 8th grade. It was time to think about the future. During one of my nighttime observations of the adit, I saw those very UAZs pulling up to his garage. New, well-maintained, with the characteristic military camouflage. Usually there were several mechanics in the village, but for some reason these ones turned only to him. Regularly, once or twice a week. It was a strange coincidence, just on the days when the adit was bustling with work. Sometimes the cars would arrive dirty, with characteristic smudges on their sides, as if they were carrying something heavy over washed-out roads. The same night that Peter died, there was a fire in the garage. The official theory is that the wiring shorted out. It was in the far corner, where the workbench with the magazine was. When I went to look at the ashes, there was already a policeman, Igor Simmons. He was studying the charred remains of workbenches and cabinets too closely, as if he were looking for something specific. "What do you think, Alexei Ivanovich? What happened to the wiring?" he asked, lighting expensive cigarettes, unusual for his salary. "Lately we have had there's been a lot of incidents. People going missing, fires. It's a strange time." There was a professional interest in his eyes that was not typical of the ordinary rural policeman. He spoke slowly, as if probing the ground. He asked me about my work in the reserve, wondering if I had noticed anything unusual lately. He was especially interested in patrol routes, as if he was calculating something in his mind. Then he mentioned that Peter had been repairing some special equipment shortly before he died. "But that's just a rumor. You know how it is in our village. They like to talk." I nodded, keeping the conversation going, but I could sense he was looking into something, checking up on what I knew. And his interest in the fire seemed a little too professional, especially considering he usually rarely took an interest in such incidents. I learned from the clerk at the local store that Peter had stopped by the post office the day before he died to send some kind of letter to the city. He was in a hurry, asking for a rush delivery, and the next morning he was found dead in the garage under his car. To those who knew the mechanic well, the picture looked strange. The tools in the garage were scattered as they were. Peter never worked like that. He even had his screwdrivers in strict order. His workbench with the magazine had burned down completely, even though it was farthest away from the suspected fire. In the iron toolbox, which was barely touched by the fire, there were only receipts and old invoices for spare parts. All indications were that his death was not accidental. He'd seen something while repairing their cars, something that made him rush to move, and something he'd written about in that last letter. But most importantly, I realized that the circle of the initiated is much wider than it seemed at first. The director of the reserve and the district officer, and who knows who else in the village, all of them were part of some big, carefully concealed operation, an operation for which they would stop at nothing. By early April, the nights were getting warmer. The snow was still lingering in the shadows of the trees, but spring was already taking hold. I decided it was time. 3 nights in a row I watched the site, noting all the movements of people, memorizing the shift schedule. A kilometer away from the adit, in a thick spruce forest, I equipped a cache. I put there a stock of food, warm clothes, a walkie-talkie, and some medicines. In the TAIGA, you never know what might come in handy. In the cache, I left a notebook with all the notes. If something goes wrong, it is important to keep the information. On the night of April 12th, there was a scheduled power outage in the village. a common thing for the 90s. I knew about it in advance. The announcement hung in the post office. The darkness was to be my advantage. The night vision device gave me a good head start, especially against those who were used to relying on electric light. I moved cautiously, following old hunting trails. I'd learned every bush in the reserve over the years. In the darkness, my eyes habitually picked out the right landmarks: an old pine with a split top, a scattering of boulders by the creek, a fallen birch. It was quiet near the adit. Without electricity, the work had come to a standstill. Only at the entrance loomed the lone figure of a guard. Through the NVR, it was possible to see how he occasionally looked at his watch. Apparently, he was waiting for the end of his shift. At 2:30, his attention was attracted by a noise from the village. I waited until the guard was once again distracted and slipped to the side entrance, the same one I had discovered during the last inspection. The camouflage was good, but the fresh footprints in the snow gave away that it had been used regularly. Inside, it smelled damp and technical. The beam of a flashlight picked out concrete walls and metal structures from the darkness. All of this was clearly not built for gold mining. The corridor went downward, branching off into several tunnels. I chose the right one. There was a faint draft. After 100 meters, the tunnel led to a spacious room. Even without light, it was clear that people worked here all the time. Racks of equipment, tables, some instruments under covers. Voices came from the far corridor. I barely had time to slip behind a massive cabinet. The baritone of the district officer was clearly distinguishable among the voices. They were discussing the reduction of funding from Moscow. It was clear from the conversation, because of the crisis, the facility would have to be mothballed, as it had already been in '59. Only now, it seemed, forever. After waiting for the footsteps to subside in the depths of the tunnel, I headed for the exit. There was nothing more to do here. The story seemed to be coming to an end of its own accord. The following weeks confirmed it. The activity around the adit gradually quieted down. First the guards disappeared, then the equipment was removed. By the end of April, all work was finally curtailed. In May, a construction crew arrived. In 3 days, they bricked up all the entrances to the adit, both the main and side entrances. They worked quickly and accurately, clearly not for the first time. After them, there were only concrete plugs and warning signs about the danger of collapse. The last one to leave was the policeman. I saw him standing at the entrance to the adit, finishing his cigarette. There was a sense of doom in his posture. Putting out the cigarette butt, he looked once more at the concrete wall and left. A week later, he was transferred to another neighborhood. Gradually, life in the settlement returned to normal. People stopped disappearing, again reached the forest for mushrooms and berries. Only old people still long avoided the clearing near the old adit. And I, going around the territory, more and more often wondered what these underground tunnels were really hiding. Some secrets, apparently, will remain buried deep in the Siberian taiga. Almost 30 years have passed. A lot has changed during this time. The village is half deserted. In the 90s, many people left in search of a better life. The old office of the reserve burned down in '98, and the archives disappeared with it. I never saw Voronin again. They said he had moved somewhere to the south. The village prefers not to remember the events of that spring, and there are few people left who remember. The new generation has grown up, and for them the adit is just an old abandoned mine, a place where one should not go because of the risk of a cave-in. I sometimes pass by on my rounds. The concrete plugs are blackened by time, overgrown with moss. The warning signs are rusty and barely legible. Nature takes its course. Young trees break through the old rock dumps and cover the trails with dense undergrowth. Only sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, it seems to me that there is a rumbling sound coming from under the ground. Maybe it's the wind in the old tunnels, or maybe... However, some mysteries are better left buried under the thickness of the earth and time. This is the end of the story of mysterious events in the Central Siberian Reserve. But how many more such objects are hidden in the vast Siberian taiga? What was really going on in those underground tunnels, and why did the state so hastily close the facility? And most importantly, where have all the missing people gone? Friends, if you like this story, support the channel with a like. Subscribe. There are many more mysterious stories from the depths of the Siberian taiga. Write in the comments your versions. What really hid that attic? Thanks for watching. Take care and see you in the next episodes.